Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. This is in continuation of my previous video in which we had written a logic to retrieve data from my database using Entity Framework Code Navigation property. And we are going to continue further on that part. In this particular controller, we are going to first of all insert a record into my user table and user profile table. So let's get started and start creating a record inside this. The first step, I need to check whether a department with my department name exists into my database or not. I'll write down where department details or where department basically is equals to sample db context dot departments. Now notice one thing. Last time in my last controller, I basically fetch a record from my department table based on the ID column itself, and that ID was primary key. So I simply use find async method. But this time I know that I don't have an ID column. Rather than in my user request, I have a department name. So I cannot use find async over here because find async will only work with the primary keys. So what I can do, I can write it down sample db context dot departments dot where. And this where is my linQ method. I'll pass a department name as x dot department name dot equals request dot department name. And this will basically get converted into select star from dbo.departments where department name is equals to request dot department name or whatever I am passing as my parameter. Okay, so that will be my equivalent SQL query that will be generated. Then we'll check if department is not equals to null. This is just a safe check to ensure that whatever department name which I am passing from my user table from my request itself, that should have certain value. Then I'll write it down. If department is not equals to null, then user and create an object of my user table. And then inside a user, I'll give the name as request.name. And then I'll give the email as request.email. I'll give the department ID as department dot ID. Now see, here is a difference. This department is basically a part of my I queryable, and this is I queryable, and I should make it into I enumerable. Again, a separate topic. What is difference between I queryable and I enumerable? I will be again covering it in some different time, but this should be converted into my I enumerable over here. But apart from converting into I enumerable, I also have a difference because this department is basically a list of department, and in my user table I only have a single department. Okay, so instead of using this where clause, I can also use first and default, and this first or default will again create a query, and it will not give me a to list of object. Rather than it will only give me the first object. So the query will be something like this: select top one asterisk from my table, because I am using first and default. And with first and default, I can simply use department dot, and let's use await, and I can use department dot ID. So this department ID will be an ID that basically a department which I am passing from my request itself. And then the most important thing is a user profile data, because remember we need to insert record into both the tables simultaneously using an EF code. So I'll go over there and create a new profile and give the name as new user profile, and inside a user profile object I'll create a address is equivalent to request dot user profile dot address, then city is equals to request dot user profile dot city, and country is equals to request dot user profile dot country, and let's bind the last column, and nothing is pending. So these all are my IDs property. So in this way you can see that I have created basically a user object and a user profile object. Now I'm going to insert a record into my table and write it down where user data or maybe a user response is equals to sample db context dot users dot add and give the name as user, and let's use add async over here again, and then this should be my available call. And finally I'll write down int rows created v context dot save changes async. Okay, so in this way what we are noticing that we are basically creating a new user into my application. I'm creating a new user profile into my database, and then I'm doing a save changes. Now this is a crucial part to understand that this save changes is basically maintaining a transaction as well. So while working with Entity Framework Core, there is no need of using a explicit transaction until and unless you have a very specific requirement. So whenever you call a save changes once, and no matter how many tables you are trying to insert a record, you can see in this case I am inserting a record into my user table followed by user profile table. This will basically create two different keys. Let me navigate back to my SQL to explain this bit to you. If you can see the table structure, this ID of user is basically a foreign key in my user ID. And whenever I run this command, and whenever I run these two things or these command against my entity framework code, whatever ID that got generated from here will automatically inserted into this column. So you can see that this ID will be automatically a part of my user ID, and that too is maintained by my entity framework code. No need to do it manually. And even if you find if you have any issue in inserting a record into, let's say, a user profile table, the record of the user table will be automatically rollback because EF core maintain transaction internally. So this save changes basically maintain a transaction internally. Now, if you're trying to insert a multiple save changes method, then you need to maintain a separate transaction. But if you call a single save change method, then whatever the context that you have created, they all will be either saved or they will be rolled back. Okay, so that is an internal process. Now I want to show you this piece of code running. So I'll not run this from my make command. Rather than use a traditional way of running it by clicking on the green button, let's run it. So running it will again build my entire code, the thing that we were doing from my make command. It will build compile my entire project, and then it should open up a application into a particular port number. And if I again navigate back and if I refresh my browser, now I have a department controller and I am having a user controller as well. Okay, so let's start first of all by creating a new user into my database. So let's add a new value. My username is, let me put my name over here, and then my email address. So let's say rahul@gmail.com. The department name, I'm going to put a valid department, and this is the place where you should be a little bit more uh, should be more focused on getting a correct department name over here. So let's retrieve a correct department name and let's use technology. So I'll go over there and I'll pass technology over there, and then user profile, let's say maybe address is Delhi, maybe city is Delhi, and my country is India. And I'm going to basically insert these records into my user table and click on execute. I am already applied a breakpoint. You can see that all the values are coming over here, and I have this technology and everything. Okay. And in my user profile, I'm also passing these values, the one that we are taking as a user input. So first of all, it will basically try to retrieve a record from a database based on my department name. And if I navigate to department name and if I press F10, this should give me a department name. Okay. And since I have not used this way, so you can see the department name as technology is given to me. But I want to show you one interesting thing. And let me bring back terminal over here. The command that got executed against this is select top one from ID. Let me again show this bit to you. Okay. So the command that got executed is select top one department ID, department name from department, where department name is equals to request.department name. So whatever department name I'm passing in the request, that will be passed against my database. But see this top one, and this top one is only happening because in my code I have used a first or default. If I had used the previous way, which is where, then this top one was will not be applied. Okay. Then I proceed further, and then I'll start creating a record. So I created my entire user object, and this time I'll use user.addAsync and save changes. And you can see the save changes is giving me basically two rows created, which means one row got inserted into my user table, and then it also got inserted into my user profile table. If I navigate back to my terminal, you can see SQL basically created two rows, or it basically inserted records into two different tables. The first one is insert into user, followed by department, department ID, email name, and I'm passing all the values. The second one is insert into user profile. Because I told you that SQL will basically, or an ORM will basically create two different queries in order to insert record into database, and these are two different queries. Let me navigate back to my SQL and verify the changes. So if I go to my SQL side again, and if I run these two tables, you notice that a record got inserted. And see, my first ID is ID followed by name, and this ID is again a part of my user ID column. And that too is done internally. I need not to have worry about it if there will be any kind of maybe an issue into my application, then entire statement will be rolled back by an EF core because of an internal transactions. So I have simply inserted a record, and these both records are there. I'll simply run it, and then you can see that a user ID as one is automatically inserted, and that will be a part of my user profile table. I'll again navigate back to my browser to insert a new record, and let me first of all remove the breakpoint which I have already applied into my source code, and let's run it. So now I'll get a response which is my created. Now this method is the previous one, it should be updated. Let me create a newer entry. Maybe I should put something different. Maybe the name is, let's say, Ramesh, and let's use the different email address for it, and I'll just keep it as it is. I just want to show you the second record will be inserted. Click on execute, it will process, it will follow the entire process. Again, if I navigate back to my SQL, you will notice that another row will be there, and that too will have a different ID, although they belong to a same department. Now you can see they both belong to 4 department, which is technology. And in the department section, I am having one to many mapping. But in my user profile, I am having one to one mapping. And this two is a part of this two itself. Okay. That is how you can see that I am basically able to insert record in both the tables. Now let's start fetching a record as well. So whatever it's got inserted, I have a relevant ID. Now let's go to your get statement and click on try it out and click on execute. And this time, if I press F10, basically, it will fetch all the records into my table from my user table. And again, navigate back to the query and see the query that got executed. Select u.id, u.department ID, u.email and name from my user table, and that's it. Okay. I'm not retrieving a record from my user profile table. I'm only getting a record from my user table itself. And then if I navigate back to the output, you will notice that I am getting two users. My user department table is null. My profile section is null because I need to write down a separate logic in order to retrieve a record from this table itself. But by default, as a part of my output, you can say I'm only getting the user details from my database. Okay, I'm not having any department or any profiles information. And again, if I navigate back to my, if I want to check with an ID column, so I'll simply pass an ID as 1 and click on execute, and this will again return the same output, but with the particular ID, and see only one record is there. But in a real application, you will be also having to retrieve record from the department table and the profile table. And obviously, you have to apply a joins for it because these two are different tables altogether. And in Entity Framework Core, I need to put some joins. But again, as I told you with the help of navigation property, there should be no need of applying a joins at all. So what we can do in order to make it work, let's quickly go to my get method and modify it. Now this get method, in the place where I'm basically modifying or retrieving a record from a user table, I will write it down slash user, then dot include. Now this dot include basically help me out to return a value from a different linked table using navigation property. So I'll write it down x tends to x dot department. And now it will create a different query and it will start retrieving a record from a department table itself. And dot include, again, I want to return a value from a user profile also. So x tends to x dot user profile. Okay. So x tends to x dot profile. And now this will basically create a join between my department table and my user table. This is not the optimized one. This is not the optimized query, but you will get a gist of it, like how this can be useful to retrieve a record from multiple tables. Let's quickly check this and let me run this code. Once I again navigate back to my browser and let me refresh it. This time I'm going to create a fetch record bus from the user table, click on try it out and click on execute. So you will notice that I am basically having a different query altogether. If I click on users, it is still fetching two records. But apart from the user, I am also retrieving a record from my department table and also from my user profile table. Okay. And this time the query that is generated is totally different. And you can see based on my department table and my user profile table. And see, this EF core is smart enough to put a join, inner join with my department and my left join as my user profile. Okay. Now, why this is happening? What is the reason behind this? I'll basically cover in the next session or next video because this is getting longer. But you can see that this is something which basically gives me a record from both the tables. And if I navigate back to my browser by removing all the breakpoints, you will notice that I am getting some issue. Okay, so I need to work on that part. But the query that is got generated is this one. And if I copy this query and if I navigate back to my SQL, you will notice that you must have probably wrote the same query if you wanted to put retrieve data from both the tables. And you can see that I am having a data from my user table, from my department table, and from user profile table. So everything is there in a single query itself. Now, as I told you, this is not the optimized query, the most optimized one, because see, it is retrieving all the columns from all the tables, and this is not something which you must have want. You really want to have a full control of the column that are there as a part of a response itself. So that is something which we also have to do. So we'll navigate again back to my controller, and the place where I'm doing a to list async, I should be using a select. Okay. And in the select, either I can create a new custom object or maybe I can also use an anonymous object to return the responses and then write down dot to list async. Now I only want couple of properties. I don't need everything else. Okay. Maybe I can say that I only want to retrieve a username from my database. So I'll write down x dot z dot name. I also want that I should be returning its email. So it should be z dot email. I want a department name in my response. So it should be z dot department dot department name, and see if I want to retrieve department, I have to use the department navigation property. Then finally, if I also want to retrieve maybe address of an end user, so z dot user profile, sorry, profile, and then address. And now it will give me a record from my profile table or user profile table. And let's say if I also want to pass city, So this should be z dot city. Okay. So I only want to retrieve these columns from my table, and see, with the help of the select statement, my entire query will be shortened. If I run it again and if I navigate back to my browser, so let's navigate back to my browser itself, and let's refresh my application once. And this time I only want to retrieve few columns from my database. I'll click on try it out, click on execute. It will hit my code base, and see, now I'm getting a response, and I'm only getting a limited column. So you will notice that because I'm getting a limited column, so that's why it's there. And in my response section, I will be having a limited column. But the main thing which I want to show you is not the limited column which I am returning. Because you have reduced a select statement, Entity Framework has also changed the query that got created. If I copy this again and if I navigate to my SQL Server, you will notice that earlier I was basically fetching all the column from all my tables, but this time I'm only fetching the columns that I have put into my select statement. So this is a very handy feature in an entity framework core, and this is very important from an performance perspective as well, because if you keep on fetching those columns which are not required in your result set, in your output, then it will definitely take a performance hit of your application. So instead of this, what you should be doing is you should be simply creating a query, and you will only fetching out those columns which you want as a part of a response set. And it can be only done if you pass a statement or the column name in the text statement. So in this way, you can see that with the help of my navigation property in my EF core, I can basically insert a record into my database itself by passing the object name. And I can also retrieve a record from a database, and I can apply a queries or joins also. Now, how the joins got created, what kind of joins it will create, that is something which I'll cover in the next session or maybe a next video. But so this is it from my side for this video. Please stay tuned and please like, share, and subscribe to this channel so that it will keep me motivated and I'll keep you a new content for you. Thanks you.